end the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, the church bells ring with a secret that shatters the calm. When bell-ringer Thomas Lane vanishes, Miss Jane Marple uncovers a hidden sapphire brooch, a scandal from 1890, and a trail of clue-scripted notes, a brass button, and an ornate key. As whispers of betrayal lead to a tragic confession, can she unravel the truth before the bells fall silent forever? Chapter 1. The bells of St. Mary's village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft light of a late summer Sunday. The air carried the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass, and the rhythmic tolling of the church bells from St. Mary's steeple wove itself into the fabric of the morning, as familiar to the villagers as their own heartbeats. For generations, those bells had marked the passage of time christenings, weddings, funerals, and the quiet Sundays that stitched the village's life together. But on this particular morning, as Miss Jane Marple sat by her open window with her knitting needles clicking softly, something in the bell's cadence struck her as wrong. Miss Marple, a slight figure in a lavender cardigan, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, was not one to dismiss a fleeting impression. Her sharp blue eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, flickered toward the church as the bells faltered a fraction too long a pause, a note that jarred rather than soothed. She set her knitting aside, her hands still for the first time that morning. "Curious," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the distant chimes. "Very curious indeed." St. Mary Mead was a place where little went unnoticed, least of all by Miss Marple, whose unassuming presence belied a mind that missed nothing. She had lived in the village all her life, in the same neat house with its rose trellises and polished brass knocker, and she knew its rhythms as intimately as she knew the patterns in her knitting. The bells, rung by Thomas Lane, a man as steady as the church itself, were never out of step, yet today they were. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and decided a walk to the church might clarify matters. The path to St. Mary's wound passed the vicarage, where roses climbed the stone walls, and the blue bore in, where a few early patrons lingered over their pints. Miss Marple nodded politely to Mrs. Weatherby, who was sweeping her doorstep with vigorous disapproval of the world at large. "Good morning, Mrs. Weatherby," she called, her voice bright but her eyes scanning the street. Mrs. Weatherby, a stout woman with a penchant for gossip, paused her broom. "Morning, Miss Marple. Did you hear those bells? Not right, are they? Thomas Lane's getting careless, mark my words." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression giving nothing away. "Perhaps," she said, "though Thomas is usually so reliable." She moved on, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones, her mind turning over Mrs. Weatherby's words. Thomas Lane, a widower in his 50s, had rung the bells for nearly 3 decades. He was a quiet man, methodical, with a face weathered by years of outdoor labor and a manner that invited little conversation. Carelessness did not suit him. Something else, Miss Marple thought, must be at play. The church of St. Mary stood at the heart of the village, its grey stone tower rising above the yew trees that guarded the churchyard. The bells had fallen silent now, their final notes lingering in the air like an unresolved question. Miss Marple pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the cool, shadowed interior. The scent of old wood and wax polish greeted her, along with the faint echo of footsteps from the nave. Reverend Clement, a nervous man with a habit of misplacing his spectacles, emerged from the vestry, his face flushed. "Miss Marple." "A pleasure, as always," he said, though his smile was strained. "You're early for the service." "I thought I'd take a look at the bells," she replied, her tone light but her eyes keen. They sounded different today. "The vicar's smile faltered. Did they? I hadn't noticed." "Thomas was up there, as usual, though I haven't seen him since he finished. Perhaps he was distracted." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice neutral. She glanced toward the spiral staircase leading to the belfry. "Might I have a look? I've always been fond of the bells." Reverend Clement hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, though it's a steep climb. Mind your step." The belfry was reached by a narrow stone staircase that wound tightly upward, its steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. Miss Marple ascended slowly, her hand on the rope rail, her mind alert. The air grew cooler as she climbed, and the faint hum of the bell's resonance lingered in the walls. She found the belfry empty, the 6 great bells hanging, silent in their wooden frame. The ropes dangled, slightly frayed, and the stone floor was dusted with the fine grit of age. But what caught her eye was a scrap of paper, crumpled and half hidden beneath a bell's rope. She bent to retrieve it, her movements careful. The paper was torn from a notebook, its edges rough, and scrawled in a hasty hand were 2 words, "They." "No." Miss Marple's lips pursed. She folded the note and slipped it into her handbag, her mind already weaving connections. Who were they, and what did they know? Thomas Lane, she suspected, was not merely distracted, back in the nave. She found the vicar hovering near the altar, rearranging hymnals with unnecessary vigor. "Thomas didn't mention anything unusual, did he?" she asked, her tone conversational. No, nothing at all," Reverend Clement replied too quickly. "He's a quiet sort, you know. Keeps to himself." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile polite but her eyes sharp. "I mustn't keep you, Reverend. I'll see you at the service." As she left the church, the village was stirring to life. Children played near the green, and Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, tipped his hat as he passed. Miss Marple returned the gesture, her thoughts elsewhere. Thomas Lane had not been seen since the bells stopped, and the note in her handbag suggested trouble. She resolved to visit Mrs. Price, Thomas's sister, who lived in a small cottage near the edge of the village. Mrs. Price was a thin woman with graying hair and a nervous habit of twisting her apron. She welcomed Miss Marple with a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "It's not like Thomas to miss church," she said, her voice low. "He's always there, rain or shine. I went by his cottage this morning, but he wasn't home." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes gentle but probing. Did he seem worried lately? Perhaps about the bells? Mrs. Price hesitated, her fingers tightening on her apron. "He did say something odd last week. Said the bells were haunted, almost. That they held secrets. I thought he was tired, you know, working too hard at the forge and the church. But he was insistent. Secrets." Miss Marple's voice was soft. Encouraging Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He said he'd found something in the belfry, something old. Wouldn't tell me more, but he was different after that. Jumpy, like he was being watched." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. "And did he mention anyone else? Someone he might have spoken to about this?" "No, but he was out late a few nights, meeting someone in the churchyard. I saw him once, from my window, but it was too dark to see who it was." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dr. Haydock, the village physician. his face serious. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Price," he greeted them, removing his hat. "I heard Thomas didn't ring the bells properly today. Is he unwell?" Mrs. Price's eyes filled with tears. "He's gone, Doctor. No one's seen him since last night." Dr. Haydock frowned, his hands tightening on his hat. "That's troubling. I'll check his cottage again. Perhaps he's taken ill." Miss Marple watched the doctor closely, noting the slight tremor in his voice. "You were fond of Thomas, weren't you, Doctor?" she asked, her tone mild. "Of course," he replied, a touch too quickly. "A good man, reliable." After he left, Miss Marple sat in silence, her tea cooling. The bells, the note, Thomas's absence, and now Dr. Haydock's Unisit was a puzzle, and she was determined to piece it together. She thanked Mrs. Price and walked home, her mind turning over the details. The village, with its quiet charm, hid currents of unease, and Miss Marple knew better than most that even the smallest ripple could conceal a deeper truth. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the churchyard. The yew trees cast long shadows, and the bells remained silent. She thought of the note, "They know," and wondered who they might be. Clara Voss, the postmistress, had been seen lingering near the church lately, her sharp eyes always watching, and Mr. Petherick, with his knowledge of the village's history, might know more than he let on. Even Reverend Clement's nervousness suggested something unspoken. As she turned from the window, Miss Marple made a decision. She would attend the evening service, not to pray, but to observe. People, she knew, revealed themselves in the smallest ways: a glance, a hesitation, a word out of place. And in St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as old as the stones, she would find the truth behind the bells' discord. The church was half full that evening, the congregation murmuring softly as the organ played. Miss Marple took her usual pew, her eyes scanning the faces. Clara Voss sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly. Dr. Haydock was absent, which was unusual for a Sunday. Reverend Clement's sermon was halting, his eyes darting to the belfry door more than once, and in the back, Mrs. Weatherby whispered to her neighbour, her words carrying just far enough for Miss Marple to catch. "Thomas Lane's run off, I wager." Always was a strange one. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Run off? No, Thomas was not the sort. Something had happened in that belfry, and the answer lay in the village's quiet corners. As the service ended and the congregation spilled into the twilight, she lingered, her eyes on the churchyard. A figure moved near the lich gate, too distant to identify, but the movement was furtive, deliberate. She made a mental note to investigate further. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. The note from the belfry lay on the table, its words stark in the lamplight. They know, she thought of Thomas's late night meetings, Mrs. Price's fear, and the bell's uneven toll. St. Mary Mead was a place of habits and routines, but it was also a place of secrets, buried deep and guarded fiercely. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and sharp mind, was just the person to uncover them. The night was still, the village asleep, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from restful. Tomorrow, she would speak to Mr. Petherick about the churches, history, and pay a visit to Clara Voss. The bells of St. Mary's had spoken, and their message was one of trouble. As she extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity, tempered by a certainty that the truth, however hidden, would not elude her for long. Chapter 2. The empty belfry, the morning after the discordant bells. St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, wrapped herself in a woolen shawl and set out for St. Mary's Church. Her steps were measured, her umbrella tucked under her arm, but her mind was as alert as ever, turning over the puzzle of Thomas Lane's absence and the cryptic note she had found in the belfry. The village, with its orderly charm, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next note in a melody gone awry. The churchyard was quiet, the yew trees dripping with moisture from the night's mist. Miss Marple paused at the lych gate, her sharp eyes scanning the gravestones, their inscriptions softened by time and moss. She noted the fresh footprints in the dew-soaked grass, leading toward the church door. Someone had been here early, and not for prayer, she suspected. Pushing open the heavy oak door, she stepped into the nave, where the air was cool and carried the faint scent of incense from the previous evening's service. Reverend Clement was already there, fussing with a stack of hymnals near the pulpit. His spectacles were perched precariously on his nose, and his hands moved with a nervous energy that Miss Marple found telling. "Good morning, Reverend," she said, her voice gentle but her gaze steady. "I thought I'd take another look at the belfry, if you don't mind. The bells yesterday were so unusual." The vicar's hands stilled, and he looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and unease. "Miss Marple, you do take an interest in the oddest things," he said, attempting a smile. "I'm afraid there's nothing to see up there, just ropes and bells, you know. Thomas must have been off his form." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "But I'd like to see for myself. One never knows what small detail might explain things." Reverend Clement hesitated, then nodded, his fingers twisting the corner of a hymnal. "Very well. The stairs are steep, mind. And, well, do be careful." His voice held a note of caution that Miss Marple filed away for later consideration. The spiral staircase to the belfry seemed narrower today, the stone walls damp under her gloved hand. She climbed slowly, her thoughts circling back to the note. "They know." The words suggested a secret, one Thomas Lane had stumbled upon, and one that had perhaps cost him his peace. At the top, the belfry was as she had left it, silent, the great bells looming like sentinels in the dim light. The ropes hung still, their frayed ends brushing the floor. She examined the spot where she had found the note, but nothing else caught her eye. The stone walls were bare, the wooden beams worn but unremarkable. Yet the air felt heavy, as if the belfry itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small wooden stool in the corner, one Thomas often used during long ringing sessions. It was slightly askew, as if moved in haste. She knelt, her knees protesting, and peered beneath it. There, caught in a crack in the floorboards, was a single brass button, its surface tarnished but etched with a faint designer cross entwined. With ivy, she retrieved it carefully, wrapping it in her handkerchief. It was not Thomas's, she was certain. His coats were plain, functional. This button belonged to someone else, someone who had been here recently. Descending the stairs, she found the vicar still in the nave, now polishing the brass candlesticks with unnecessary vigor. "Did you find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice a shade too bright. "Nothing much," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Just dust and old ropes. But tell me, Reverend, has anyone else been up there lately, besides Thomas? I mean," the vicar's polishing slowed, "not that I know of. The belfry's not a place people visit. Too cramped, too cold." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," she said lightly. Just curious. Thomas was so particular about his bells, wasn't he? I imagine he'd notice anyone poking about. Reverend Clement's face tightened, and he turned back to his candlesticks. Yes, he was. Very particular. His tone suggested the conversation was closed. But Miss Marple was not so easily deterred. She left the church and made her way to the Blue Boar Inn, where the village's pulse could often be felt over a pot of tea. The inn was quiet this morning, save for a few farmers discussing the weather. Mrs. Bantry, a cheerful woman with a penchant for bright scarves, was behind the counter, pouring tea for Miss Marple before she could even ask. You're out early, Miss Marple, she said, her eyes twinkling. Heard about Thomas Lane, have you? Vanished, they say. Never thought he'd be the sort to run off. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. Nor I, Mrs. Bantry. He was a steady man, wasn't he? Did he ever mention anything unusual about the bells? Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Not to me, but I heard him talking to young Peter Voss last week, out by the pump. Something about the bells being wrong. Peter laughed it off, said Thomas was seeing ghosts, but Thomas looked serious, I'll tell you that. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the name. Peter Voss, Clara's nephew, was a lanky young man with a quick smile and a reputation for mischief. Interesting, she said. And where is Peter now, do you know? Off to market in Much Benham, I expect, Mrs. Bantry replied. He's always running errands for his aunt. Clara's been odd lately, too, come to think of it. Snappish, even for her. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Bantry and finished her tea, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. Clara Voss, the postmistress, was a woman of sharp tongue and sharper eyes, her small post office a hub of village gossip. If Thomas had confided in Peter, perhaps Clara knew something too, and the button in the belfry could have belonged to Peter or someone else entirely. As she stepped outside, the first raindrops began to fall, pattering softly on her umbrella. She made her way to the post office, where Clara Voss was sorting letters with her usual brisk efficiency. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back, and her pinched face softened only slightly at Miss Marple's greeting. Good morning, Miss Voss, Miss Marple said, her voice warm. I was just thinking of Thomas Lane. Such a pity he's not been seen. You knew him well, didn't you? Clara's hands paused, a letter hovering over the sorting tray. Well, enough, she said curtly. He kept to himself, mostly. Why do you ask? Oh, just village talk, Miss Marple replied, her eyes gentle but watchful. I heard he was troubled about the bells, said they held secrets. Did he ever mention anything like that to you? Clara's lips tightened, and she resumed sorting with a touch too much force. Thomas was always fanciful, she said. Bells don't hold secrets. They ring, that's all. If you'll excuse me, I've work to do. Miss Marple nodded, undeterred by the dismissal. Of course, my dear. I'll not keep you. As she turned to leave, she noticed a coat hanging on a peg behind the counter, a dark wool coat with brass buttons, one missing. The design matched the button in her handkerchief. She said nothing, but her mind was alight with possibilities. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the button and the note laid out on the table before her. The rain tapped steadily against the windows, and the village seemed to huddle under its weight. Thomas Lane was missing, the bells had rung false, and now a button linked Clara Voss to the belfry. They know, the note had said. But what? Did they know, and who were they? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to her thoughts. She would speak to Peter Voss when he returned from market, and perhaps Mr. Petherick could shed light on the church's history. For now, she knew one thing. The empty belfry held more than dust and ropes. It held the key to Thomas Lane's fate, and she would find it. Chapter 3. The widow's tales. The rain that had threatened St. Mary Mead all morning arrived in earnest by midday, cloaking the village in a grey veil that muffled sound and softened edges. Miss Jane Marple, undaunted by the weather, donned her waterproof coat and sturdy boots, her umbrella a shield against the drizzle. Her destination was the modest cottage of Mrs. Ellen Price, Thomas Lane's widowed sister, whose anxious words about her brother's unease had lingered in Miss Marple's mind. The note from the belfry, they know, and the brass button with its ivy cross design were tucked safely in her handbag. Silent clues that urged her forward. The cottage sat at the village's edge, its garden overgrown with late summer weeds, the gate creaking as Miss Marple pushed it open. The windows were curtained, giving the house a secretive air, as if it too held its own counsel. She knocked, and after a moment, Mrs. Price opened the door, her thin face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice catching. "I wasn't expecting. Please, come in." The sitting room was small, cluttered with faded photographs and a sewing basket spilling over with mending. A fire burned low in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Mrs. Price gestured to a chair, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. "You've heard then," she said, sitting opposite. "About Thomas. No one's seen him since Saturday night. I'm sick with worry." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "I have heard, Mrs. Price, and I'm so sorry. It's most unlike Thomas to disappear. I thought perhaps you might know something, more something he said or did recently that seemed out of the ordinary." Mrs. Price's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, and she glanced toward the window, as if expecting to see someone watching. "He was different these past weeks," she said, her voice low. "Ever since he started poking about in the church records. He'd come home late, muttering about the bells, saying they were cursed, that they held secrets no one should. No, I told him it was nonsense, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes gentle but keen. "What sort of secrets, my dear? Did he say anything specific?" Mrs. Price hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "He said he'd found something in the belfry papers, old ones, hidden behind a stone. He wouldn't show me, but he said they told a story about the church, something from long ago. He was scared, Miss Marple. Not for himself, but for what it meant. He said, if they find out, Ellen, it'll be the end of everything. Miss Marple's voice was soft, encouraging. Mrs. Price shook her head. "He wouldn't say who, but he was meeting someone at night, in the churchyard. I saw him once, slipping out after dark. I begged him to tell me, but he just said it was for my own good to stay out of it." Her voice broke, and she pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand. "You've been very brave, Mrs. Price. Did Thomas mention anyone he might have spoken to? Perhaps Clara Voss or young Peter?" Mrs. Price's eyes widened briefly at Clara's name, then darted away. "Clara? No, he never said her name, but Peter. He did talk to Peter once or twice. Said the boy was curious, always asking about the bells. Thomas liked him, thought he was clever. But I don't think he told him anything important." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. The mention of old papers hidden in the belfry was new, and it aligned with Thomas's note. She thought of the brass button, wondering if it could belong to Clara's coat, or perhaps someone else who had ventured into the belfry in these night meetings. She said gently, "Did you ever see who Thomas met?" "No, it was too dark," Mrs. Price replied, her voice trembling. "But once, I heard voices low, angry. I couldn't make out the words, but Thomas came back looking like he'd seen a ghost. That was the night before he went missing." Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded in her lap. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Price. Try not to worry too much. Thomas may yet turn up, and I'm sure the police will do all they can." Her tone was reassuring, but her thoughts were far from calm. The picture was growing clearer. Thomas had uncovered something in the belfry, something tied to the church's past, and it had frightened him enough to meet someone in secret. That someone, she suspected, was connected to the button and the note. As she rose to leave, Mrs. Price clutched her arm. "Miss Marple, you'll find out what happened to him, won't you? You always see things others miss." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes kind but resolute. "I'll do my best, my dear. Now, you must rest. And if you remember anything else, no matter how small, do let me know." The rain had softened to a fine mist as Miss Marple stepped outside, her umbrella shielding her from the damp. The village was quiet, the streets empty save for a delivery boy cycling past, his cap pulled low. She made her way toward the centre of St. Mary Mead, her thoughts turning to the church records Mrs. Price had mentioned. Mr. Peperick, the solicitor, would know more about the church's history, and she resolved to visit him next. But first, she wanted to speak to Peter Voss, who might have heard something from Thomas that Clara had not shared. At the post office, Clara Voss was busy with a customer, her movements brisk and her face set in its usual stern lines. Miss Marple waited patiently, observing the neat stacks of envelopes and the coat on the peg, its missing button a silent accusation. When the customer left, Clara turned to her, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Back again, Miss Marple. More questions about Thomas?" "Only a few," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "I was wondering if Peter might be about. I heard he and Thomas were friendly." Clara's expression tightened, but she answered evenly. "Peter's at the Market Inn. Much Benham won't be back till evening. He and Thomas talked sometimes, but nothing serious. Boys and bells, you know how it is." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "Young people are so curious. Did Peter ever mention anything Thomas said about the bells? Perhaps something about old papers?" Clara's hand froze on the counter, just for a moment, before she resumed sorting. "Papers? No, nothing like that. Thomas was always going on about the bells, but Peter didn't pay it much mind. If you'll excuse me, I've got to close up soon." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the coat as she left. The missing button was a small thing, but in her experience, small things often led to larger truths. She walked slowly home, the mist settling on her shoulders like a shawl. The church loomed in the distance, its tower a silent sentinel over the villages. Secrets dot her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the window, the note and the button before her. The rain had stopped, and a pale sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the garden. She thought of Thomas's fear, Mrs. Price's trembling hands, and Clara's guarded demeanor. The church records, she decided, were the next step. If Thomas had found papers in the belfry, they might hold the key to his disappearance. And the button, whose coat did it come from? And why had it been left behind? As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the churchyard, where Thomas had met his mysterious companion. She would watch tonight, from the safety of her garden, where the yew trees offered cover. People, she knew, were careless in the dark, and careless people revealed truths they meant to hide. The bells of St. Mary's might be silent for now, but their secrets were beginning to speak, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Moonlight. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a stillness that seemed to deepen the village's secrets. The rain had cleared, leaving a sky pricked with stars and a half-moon casting pale light across the rooftops. Miss Jane Marple, ever watchful, stood at the edge of her garden, her dark shawl blending with the shadows of the yew trees that bordered her property. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of the churchyard, its gravestones silvered by moonlight and the lych gate, a dark silhouette against the glow. Her conversation with Mrs. Price had confirmed her suspicion that Thomas Lane's disappearance was tied to his nocturnal meetings, and she was determined to see who might venture into the churchyard tonight. Miss Marple's slight figure was nearly invisible in the gloom, her sensible shoes silent on the damp grass. She had chosen this spot carefully, hidden behind a gnarled yew that offered cover, while allowing her to observe the path to St. Mary's. Her handbag, containing the cryptic note and the brass button, rested at her feet, a reminder of the puzzle she was piecing together. The air was cool, scented with earth and the faint sweetness of late-blooming roses. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the churchyard, where the silence felt heavy, expectant, as the village clock struck 9. A faint rustle broke the stillness. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path, deliberate but cautious. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite the dim light, followed the movement. 2 figures emerged near the lych gate, their outlines blurred by the shadows, but their voices carrying in the quiet night. She recognized one immediately, Dr. Haydock, the village physician, his tall frame unmistakable even in silhouette. The other was smaller, more angular, and as they stepped into a patch of moonlight, Miss Marple saw the sharp features of Clara Voss, the postmistress. Their conversation was hushed, urgent, the words drifting to Miss Marple in fragments, hidden. "In the bells," Clara said, her voice low but edged with panic. "If they find it, it's over." Dr. Haydock's response was sharper, almost a hiss. "Keep your voice down. We can't risk anyone hearing." Thomas was a fool to meddle. Miss Marple's breath caught, her mind racing. Hidden in the bells. The phrase echoed Mrs. Price's account of Thomas's fears, and it suggested a secret far more tangible than village gossip. She strained to hear more, but the pair moved closer to the church, their voices fading. As they paused near a weathered gravestone, Clara's hand darted to her pocket, then stopped, as if reconsidering. Dr. Haydock glanced around, his posture tense, and Miss Marple pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the yew. Then a small clink broke the silencer, metallic sound, faint but distinct. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she saw Clara stoop, her hand brushing the grass. When she stood, her fingers were empty, and she hurried after Dr. Haydock, who was already moving toward the church door. They slipped inside, leaving the churchyard, empty once more. Miss Marple waited, counting the seconds, until she was certain they would not return. Then, moving with a quiet grace that belied her years, she crossed the path to the spot where Clara had paused. The moonlight revealed a glint among the grass, a small, ornate key, its surface worn but intricately engraved with a pattern of vines. Miss Marple retrieved it, her gloved fingers careful not to disturb the surrounding earth. She turned it over in the dim light, noting its weight and craftsmanship. It was no ordinary key, not the sort used for the church's modern locks. Her mind flashed to the vestry, the locked chest Reverend Clement had mentioned with such unease. Could this be the key to a door to something older, hidden within the church's ancient walls? She tucked the key into her handbag alongside the note and button, her thoughts spinning. Clara and Dr. Haydock's clandestine meeting confirmed her suspicion that Thomas's disappearance was no accident. Their words suggested a secret tied to the bells, one Thomas had uncovered and perhaps paid for with his freedom or worse. Miss Marple glanced at the church, its tower looming against the starry sky. The bells were silent now, but their silence spoke volumes. Returning to her garden, Miss Marple stood for a moment, her eyes on the churchyard. The village slept, its cottages dark, but she knew that sleep would elude her tonight. The key, the note, the button, these were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a secret buried in St. Mary's past. Clara's nervousness and Dr. Haydock's sharp tone suggested they were guarding it fiercely. But why? And what had Thomas known that made him so dangerous? Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the lamp and sat at her small writing desk, the key before her. Its design was old, perhaps from the last century, and it reminded her of the church's history, which Mr. Petherick had once described in detail. The bells, he had said, were recast in 1890 after a theft scandal that had faded into village lore. Could the key unlock something from that time, something Thomas had found in the belfry's hidden papers? She thought of Clara's coat, missing its button, and Dr. Haydock's presence in the churchyard. Both were respected figures in St. Mary Mead, yet their behaviour tonight was anything but respectable. Miss Marple's needles, lying idle on the table, seemed to beckon, but she ignored them. Instead, she took out a small notebook and began jotting down names and connections. Thomas Lane, Clara Voss, Dr. Haydock, Peter Voss, Reverend Clement. Each name was a thread in the web, and the bells were at its centre. As the clock chimed 10, Miss Marple made a decision. Tomorrow, she would visit Mr. Petherick to inquire about the church's history, particularly the theft of 1890. She would also keep an eye on Clara and Dr. Haydock, whose alliance suggested a shared stake in whatever Thomas had discovered, and the key she would test it in the vestry, discreetly, when the vicar was occupied. People, she knew, were never as careful as they thought, and in a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone's business, secrets had a way of surfacing. The moonlight filtered through her curtains, casting soft patterns on the floor. Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and stood at the window, her gaze returning to the church. The shadows in the churchyard were still now, but she knew they held more than moonlight. Somewhere in St. Mary's, a truth was waiting, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would find it. Chapter 5. The Key's Secret. The morning sun broke through the lingering clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a pale glow on the wet cobblestones and the thatched roof still damp from the previous day's rain. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea cooling beside her, as she examined the ornate key she had found in the churchyard the night before. Its intricate vine pattern gleamed faintly in the light, suggesting age and craftsmanship far beyond the ordinary locks of the village. The note from the belfry, they know, and the brass button with its Ivory Cross design lay beside it. silent companions in her growing collection of clues. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by the years, studied the keys, contours, her mind turning over the conversation she had overheard between Clara Voss and Dr. Haydock. Hidden in the bells, Clara had said. The phrase echoed in Miss Marple's thoughts, a thread connecting Thomas Lane's disappearance to a secret older than the village's memory. She sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window where the church tower of St. Mary's stood sentinel. Over the village, the key, she suspected, was no mere trinket. It might unlock the vestry chest Reverend Clement had mentioned with such unease. Or perhaps something older, tied to the church's history. Thomas's talk of cursed bells and hidden papers, as relayed by his sister, pointed to a discovery in the belfry, something that had frightened him enough to meet someone in secret, and perhaps led to his vanishing. Miss Marple's fingers traced the key's edges, her mind sifting through possibilities. To unravel this, she needed more than village gossip. She needed facts, and no one knew St. Mary Mead's past better than Mr. Petherick, the solicitor whose meticulous records were as much a village institution as the church itself. Tucking the key, note, and button into her handbag, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her appearance as unassuming as ever, but her purpose resolute. The village was stirring as she stepped outside, the air fresh with the scent of wet earth and honeysuckle. A few early risers nodded as she passed Mrs. Weatherby, sweeping her doorstep with her usual disapproval, and young Peter Voss, back from Much Benham, unloading a cart near the post office. Miss Marple noted his quick glance in her direction, his usual easy grin absent. She made a mental note to speak with him later. His conversations with Thomas might hold a clue. However small Mr. Petherick's office was a narrow building near the village green, its windows framed by ivy that seemed to whisper secrets of its own. The solicitor, a wiry man with pince-nez and a penchant for precision, welcomed Miss Marple with a courteous nod, ushering her into a room lined with leather-bound ledgers and the faint smell of ink. Miss Marple, he said, adjusting his glasses, this is a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the visit? She smiled, settling into a chair, her handbag resting on her lap. I've been thinking about St. Mary's, Mr. Petherick, the bells in particular. I understand they were recast in 1890 after some trouble. A theft, wasn't it? I thought you might know the details. Mr. Petherick's eyebrows rose slightly, but he leaned back, his fingers steepled. You've a sharp memory, Miss Marple. Yes, 1890 was a curious year for the church. The original bells, 5 of them, cast in the 17th century, were stolen, or so the story goes. It caused quite a scandal at the time. The parish raised funds to recast them, and the new bells were hung the following year. But what was stolen, and by whom, was never clear. The records are vague, deliberately so, I suspect. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. Vague, that's most interesting. Was there anything valuable associated with the bells, something that might have been hidden in them? Mr. Petherick frowned, his fingers tapping the desk. There were rumours, of course. The bells were said to have been a gift from a wealthy parishioner, Sir Henry Vosclera's great-grandfather, as it happens. Some whispered he'd hidden something in the bells before they were cast. A family heirloom, or perhaps something less savoury. Jewels, papers, even gold, depending on who told the tale. But when the bells were stolen, nothing was found, and the matter was hushed up. Sir Henry's descendants, the Voss family, were keen to let it die down. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice soft, but her mind racing. Clara Voss's name cropping up again, and her ancestors' connection to the bells added a new layer to the puzzle. And these papers Thomas Lane was so interested in, do you know where they might be kept? Mr. Petherick hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ledgers behind him. The church keeps its oldest records in the vestry, in a locked chest. I've seen it myself, Oak, ironbound, from the 18th century. Reverend Clement has the key, though. I doubt he opens it often. It's mostly parish accounts, baptisms, burials. But if Thomas found something, it might have come from there. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the key in her handbag. Thank you, Mr. Petherick. You've been most helpful. One last thing, did Thomas ever consult you about his findings? The solicitor shook his head. No, he never came to me. But he was in the church often, not just for the bells. He'd been seen reading the old registers, late into the evening. Reverend Clement mentioned it, said Thomas was curious about the Voss family, of all things. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. The Voss family, the stolen bells, the locked chested, all pointed to a secret tied to Sir Henry's time. One Thomas had uncovered, and perhaps Clara was desperate to keep hidden. The key, she decided, must be tested, but discreetly. Reverend Clement's unease suggested he knew more than he let on, and she would need to tread carefully as she walked home. The village seemed to watch her, its quiet facades hiding currents of unease. She passed the post office, where Clara was visible through the window, her face drawn as she sorted letters. Peter Voss lingered outside, kicking a stone, his eyes darting to Miss Marple before he turned away. She made a note to find him later, perhaps at the Blue Boar, where he often loitered with the younger villagers. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the key in her hand. Its weight felt significant, a promise of answers. She thought of Clara's whispered words in the churchyard, hidden in the bells, and Dr. Haydock's sharp retort. The doctor, too, was part of this, his nervousness at Mrs. Price's cottage betraying a stake in the secret. And the button, with its ivy-cross design, matched Clara's coat, but could it belong to another? Dr. Haydock wore a heavy coat with similar buttons, she recalled, though she would need to confirm it. The afternoon waned, and Miss Marple decided to visit the church before evening. Reverend Clement would be at the vicarage for tea, leaving the vestry unattended. She gathered her shawl and handbag, the key a quiet weight against the note and button. The church was empty when she arrived, the nave bathed in the soft light of stained glass. The vestry door was unlocked, and she slipped inside, her heart steady despite the faint thrill of trespass. The chest stood in a corner, its oak surface scarred by time, its iron lock rusted but intact. Miss Marple drew the key from her handbag, her fingers steady as she fitted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click, the sound loud in the silent room. She lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of papers-yellowed parish records, faded letters, and a small, leather-bound book. Her eyes scanned the contents, pausing on a letter dated 1890, its ink faint but legible. It spoke of Sir Henry Voss, his donation of the bells, and a gift hidden within them, meant to secure his family's legacy. The letter hinted at a scandal, a theft to cover it, but the details were maddeningly vague. Miss Marple closed the chest, locking it carefully. The letter confirmed Mr. Petherick's story, but it raised more questions. What was the gift, and why had Thomas's discovery of it led to his disappearance? She slipped out of the vestry, her mind alight with possibilities. Clara and Dr. Haydock's meeting suggested they knew of the gift, perhaps even sought to protect, eat or conceal it. As she left the church, the bells remained silent, their quiet a stark reminder of Thomas's absence. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the belfry where Thomas had found his papers. She would return there, perhaps tomorrow, to search for the hiding place Mrs. Price had mentioned. For now, she needed to observe Clara and Dr. Haydock, whose alliance was the key to unlocking this mystery. The village, with its peaceful facade, was a web of secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was drawing the threads together, one by one. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Hesitation. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished table where her tea sat untouched. The ornate key from the churchyard, the cryptic note, and the brass button lay before her, each a silent testament to the mystery of Thomas Lane's disappearance. Her discovery in the vestry chest a letter hinting at Sir Henry Voss's hidden gift in the bells had deepened the puzzle, tying the past to the present with a thread of secrecy. Miss Marple's sharp mind turned over the details. Clara Voss's furtive meeting with Dr. Haydock, the mention of something hidden in the bells, and now the suggestion of a scandal buried in the church's history. She knew the next step was to probe further, and Reverend Clement, with his nervous demeanour and guarded references to the vestry chest, was a natural starting point. Miss Marple donned her hat and coat, her movements brisk despite the weight of her thoughts. The village of St. Mary Mead was settling into the quiet rhythm of late afternoon, with children playing on the green and the faint clatter of dishes from the Blue Boar signalling preparations for the evening crowd. The church loomed ahead, its stone tower catching the last rays of sunlight, and Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of anticipation. People, she had often observed, revealed more in their hesitations than in their words, and the vicar's unease was a clue in itself. Reverend Clement was in the vicarage garden, pruning roses with a distracted air, his spectacles slipping down. His nose, he started slightly at Miss Marple's approach, his shears pausing mid-snip. "Miss Marple." "How good to see you," he said, his voice carrying a forced cheer. "I was just tidying up before tea. Would you care to join me?" "That would be lovely," she replied, her smile gentle but her eyes watchful. "I've been thinking about poor Thomas Lane. Such a mystery, his absence. You must be quite unsettled, with the bells silent." The vicar's hands faltered, and a rose petal drifted to the ground. "Yes, most unsettling," he agreed, leading her into the vicarage. The sitting room was cozy, with a fire crackling and a tray set with teacups and a plate of biscuits. He poured tea with a slight tremor, his gaze avoiding hers. "Thomas was so reliable. I can't imagine what's kept him." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her posture relaxed but her mind alert. "He was devoted to the bells, wasn't he? Mrs. Price mentioned he'd been reading the old parish records, quite absorbed. Did he ever share what he found?" Reverend Clement's cup clinked against its saucer, a small sound in the quiet room. "Oh, bits and pieces," he said vaguely. Thomas was always curious about the church's history. He'd spend hours in the vestry, poring over those dusty registers. "I didn't pay much mind old baptisms and burials. You know, nothing remarkable. But he seemed troubled, didn't he?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone soft but insistent. "Mrs. Price said he spoke of secrets in the bells, something that worried him." The vicar's face tightened, and he adjusted his spectacles unnecessarily. "Did she?" Well, Thomas had his fancies. He thought the bells had stories to tell. "But it's just superstition," surely. The bells are, well, just bells. His voice trailed off, and he busied himself with the teapot. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly behind her spectacles. "And the vestry chest," she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I understand it holds some of those old records. Have you looked through it recently? Perhaps Thomas found something there." Reverend Clement's hand froze on the teapot, and for a moment his expression was one of unguarded alarm. "The chest? Oh, it's just papers, Miss Marple. Old sermons, accounts, nothing of interest. I keep it locked to preserve them. You. No damp and mice, such a nuisance." He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "But Thomas was so thorough. If he found something, he might have mentioned it to you, perhaps in passing." The vicar shook his head, his fingers twisting the edge of his napkin. "No, nothing specific. He did ask about the Voss family once. Something about Sir Henry and the bells, but I told him it was all ancient history. The chest is hardly worth bothering with." His eyes darted to the window, as if seeking escape, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck. She changed the subject, chatting lightly about the village fete, but her mind was elsewhere. The vicar's hesitation, his quick dismissal of the chest, confirmed her suspicion that it held more than dusty papers. The key in her handbag, with its vine-etched design, was likely the key to that chest. And Thomas's discovery, whatever it was, had stirred trouble. Reverend Clement, she sensed, was not part of the secret, but knew enough to be frightened. His nervous manner suggested he was guarding something, perhaps out of loyalty or fear. As she thanked him and rose to leave, Miss Marple glanced at the vicarage clock. The afternoon was fading, and the church would soon be empty, a perfect time to test the key. "You've been most kind, Reverend," she said. "I'll let you get back to your roses. Do let me know if you hear anything about Thomas." Of course," he replied, his relief palpable as he showed her to the door. "It's all so worrying, but I'm sure he'll turn up." Miss Marple stepped into the cooling air, her thoughts racing. The vicar's unease, coupled with Clara Voss and Dr. Haydock's clandestine meeting, pointed to a conspiracy rooted in the church's past. Sir Henry Voss's name had surfaced again, linked to the bells and a hidden gift. The chest, she was certain, held answers, and she would not delay in finding them. The church was quiet as she approached, the nave empty save for the soft echo of her footsteps. The vestry door was ajar, and she slipped inside, her heart steady despite the faint thrill of her task. The oak chest stood in its corner, its iron lock gleaming dully in the dim light. She drew the key from her handbag, her fingers steady as she fitted it into the lock. It turned smoothly, with a satisfying click, and the lid creaked open, revealing a jumble of papers and a small, leather-bound book tied with a faded ribbon. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the contents, her movements careful to disturb nothing. The book was a parish ledger from the 1880s, its pages brittle but legible. Tucked within was a folded letter, its wax seal broken, addressed to the Venvicar in a spidery hand. She unfolded it, her breath catching as she read. It was from Sir Henry Voss, dated 1889, and spoke of a gift hidden in the bells to secure his family's honor. The letter hinted at a theft plan to conceal it, orchestrated by Sir Henry himself, with the aid of unnamed allies. "Should the truth be known," he wrote, "it would ruin us all." She replaced the letter, her mind alight with connections. The gift jewels, perhaps, or documents had been hidden in the bells before their theft in 1890. and Thomas had found evidence of it, perhaps in the belfry's hidden papers. Clara, as Sir Henry's descendant, would have reason to guard such a secret, and Dr. Haydock's involvement suggested a shared stake. But why had Thomas vanished, and what had frightened the vicar? Miss Marple locked the chest and slipped out of the vestry, her thoughts turning to the belfry. If Thomas had found papers there, as Mrs. Price claimed, they might point to the gift's exact location. She would need to search, but not tonight. The village was too alert, and Clara's sharp eyes missed little. As she walked home, the church bells remained silent, their quiet a reminder of the mystery's heart. Reverend Clement's hesitation had revealed more than he intended, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was closing in on the truth. Chapter 7. The Vestry's Cluth. Morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages and lending the church tower an almost spectral air. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a pot of strong tea, sat at her kitchen table, her thoughts as sharp as the knitting needles that lay idle beside her. The ornate key, the cryptic note, and the brass button rested in her handbag, joined now by the memory of the letter she had found in the vestry chest, a letter from Sir Henry Voss, hinting at a secret gift hidden in the bells of St. Mary's, and a theft orchestrated to conceal it. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the heart of the mystery, Thomas Lane's disappearance, remained elusive. Miss Marple's sharp eyes gleamed with determination. The vestry had yielded one clue, but she suspected the belfry held more, and she would need to act before the villagers' watchful eyes tightened their net. Reverend Clement, she knew, would be occupied with a parish meeting until noon, leaving the church unattended. It was the perfect opportunity to search the belfry for the papers Thomas had found, as Mrs. Price had described. Miss Marple donned her coat, a sensible grey one that blended with the mist, and tucked her handbag under her arm. The village was quiet as she stepped out, the only sounds the distant clatter of a milk cart and the soft cooing of pigeons on the green. She passed the post office, where Clara Voss was visible through the window, her face drawn as she sorted letters with mechanical precision. Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, a sign of unease that matched Dr. Haydock's nervous demeanour. In the churchyard, the web of secrets was tightening, and she was determined to find its centre. The church of St. Mary's stood silent, its oak door yielding easily under her touch. The nave was empty, the air cool and heavy with the scent of old stone and polished wood. Miss Marple moved swiftly to the vestry, her steps light but purposeful. The oak chest, with its iron lock, stood in its corner, a mute guardian of the church's past. She hesitated, tempted to open it again, but the letter she had read yesterday had told her enough for now. Sir Henry Voss had hidden something in the bells, something valuable enough to warrant a theft in 1890, and Thomas had stumbled upon evidence of it. The belfry, she decided, was where the answers lay. The spiral staircase to the belfry was as narrow and steep as she remembered, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Miss Marple climbed carefully, her hand gripping the rope rail, her senses alert to the faint creaks and echoes of the tower. At the top, the belfry was dim, the 6 great bells hanging in their wooden frame like silent sentinels. The ropes dangled, their frayed ends brushing the floor, and the air carried a faint mustiness, as if the secrets of the past had settled into the very dust. She began her search methodically, her eyes scanning the stone walls and wooden beams. Mrs. Price had mentioned papers hidden behind a stone, and Miss Marple's fingers traced the rough surfaces, seeking a loose block or hidden crevice. The belfry was cramped, its corners shadowed. But her patience was rewarded when she found a stone near the base of the largest bell, its edges slightly misaligned. She pressed gently, and it shifted, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. Her heart quickened as she drew it out, careful not to disturb the dust that clung to it. Unwrapping the bundle, she found a collection of papers, their edges yellowed but intact. There were 3 letters and a folded map, all in a spidery hand that matched the letter from the vestry chest. The first letter, dated 1889, was from Sir Henry Voss to an unnamed accomplice, detailing a plan to hide a treasure in the bells before their casting, to be retrieved only by his heirs. The second letter, written a year later, expressed his panic when the bells were stolen, fearing the treasure had been lost. The third was a terse note, unsigned, warning that the secret must be kept at all costs, lest the Voss name fall to ruin. The map, crudely drawn, marked a spot in the belfry behind the very stone she had found. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she studied the map. It showed the belfry's layout, with an X near the largest bell, precisely where she stood. She examined the stone again, probing deeper into the cavity, but found nothing more. The treasure, whatever it was not here, perhaps taken during the theft of 1890, or perhaps hidden elsewhere. She folded the papers carefully, slipping them into her handbag. Thomas, she realized, had found these same documents, and their discovery had made him a target as she prepared to descend. A faint sound reached her creak from the staircase below. She froze, her breath shallow, her senses attuned to the silence. The creak came again, deliberate, as if someone were climbing with care. Miss Marple stepped into the shadow of a beam, her small figure blending with the gloom. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the belfry was still. Then a voice, low and urgent, echoed up the stairs. "She's here, I know it," a man said. "Dr. Haydock," his tone unmistakable. Miss Marple's heart thudded, but her mind remained clear. She clutched her handbag, the papers and key inside, and waited. The footsteps retreated, and she heard the church door close with a soft thud. Whoever had been there was gone for now. She descended quickly, her movements silent, and slipped out of the church, her eyes scanning the churchyard for any sign of movement. The mist had thickened, cloaking the village in a grey shroud, and she made her way home, her thoughts racing at her cottage. Miss Marple spread the papers on her table, the lamplight casting soft shadows across the faded ink. The letters confirmed Sir Henry Voss's secreter, treasure hidden in the bells, meant for his heirs, but lost or stolen in 1890. Clara, as his descendant, would have reason to protect that secret, especially if it threatened her family's standing. Dr. Haydock's involvement puzzled her. He was no Voss, but his presence in the churchyard and now in the church suggested a deeper connection. And the creak on the stairs, who had he been speaking to? Clara or someone else? She thought of Reverend Clement's hesitation, his reluctance to discuss the vestry chest. He knew something, perhaps not the full truth, but enough to make him nervous. The brass button, with its Ivory-cross design, linked Clara to the belfry. But Dr. Haydock's coat, she recalled, had similar buttons. She would need to confirm this, perhaps by visiting his surgery under the guise of a minor ailment. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the papers locked safely in her desk. The belfry had yielded its clue, but the treasure itself remained elusive, and Thomas's fate hung over the village like the mist outside. She resolved to watch Dr. Haydock and Clara closely, and to speak with Peter Voss, who might have heard more from Thomas than he let on. The bells of St. Mary's, silent now, were at the heart of this mystery, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to make them speak. Chapter 8. The Belfry's Revelation. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the mist of the previous day giving way to a sky of pale blue that seemed to sharpen the outlines of the villages, cottages, and the looming tower of St. Mary's Church. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. The papers she had found in the Belfry letters from Sir Henry Voss and a map marking a hiding place had confirmed a secret. Tied to the bells, a treasure meant for his heirs, but lost or hidden during the theft of 1890. The ornate key, the cryptic note, and the brass button were now joined by these documents in her handbag, each a piece of a puzzle that centered on Thomas Lane's disappearance. Her discovery in the belfry had been interrupted by Dr. Haydock's voice on the stairs, and the memory of his urgent words, "She's here, I know it," sent a chill through her. Someone was watching, and Miss Marple knew she must move carefully to uncover the truth. Her plan for the day was clear: return to the belfry to search for the treasure itself, the gift Sir Henry had hidden. The map had marked a spot behind the largest bell, and though the papers had been there, the cavity was empty of anything else. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her the belfry held more, and Thomas's fear suggested he had found it. She dressed in her usual sensible attire, a dark shawl over her coat to blend with the church's shadows, and set out. Her handbag a quiet repository of clues. The village was stirring as she walked, the green alive with children playing, and Mrs. Weatherby gossiping with a neighbour outside the Blue Boar. Miss Marple nodded politely, her eyes catching Peter Voss across the street. His lanky frame slouched against the post office wall. His gaze met hers briefly, then darted away, a flicker of unease that she filed away for later. Clara Voss, she noted, was absent from the post office window. An unusual occurrence for mid-morning. Dr. Haydock, too, was nowhere to be seen. Though his surgery door was open, a sign he was about. St. Mary's Church was quiet, the nave empty, save for the faint echo of her footsteps on the stone floor. Reverend Clement, she knew, was visiting a sick parishioner, leaving the church unattended. She climbed the spiral staircase to the belfry with care, her hand steady on the rope rail, her senses attuned to any sound. The belfry was as she had left it, the bells silent, their ropes swaying slightly in the draught. The largest bell, a hulking bronze giant, dominated the space, its surface etched with faint inscriptions from its recasting in 1891. Miss Marple knelt beside the stone she had found yesterday, its edges still loose from her earlier probing. The map had marked this spot, and though the papers were now in her possession, she suspected the treasure itself a jewel, a document, or something else might be hidden nearby. She examined the bell's base, her fingers tracing the cold metal, searching for irregularities. Near the bottom, where the bell met its wooden frame, she felt a slight giver panel, cunningly disguised, that shifted under pressure. With a gentle push, it opened, revealing a small, dusty box, its wood darkened by time. Her heart quickened as she lifted the box, its weight suggesting something substantial inside. She opened it carefully, the hinges creaking, and found a sapphire brooch, its deep blue stone catching the dim light, nestled in faded velvet. Beside it was a folded paper, a list of names in Sir Henry Voss's hand, dated 1889. The names William Carver, John Harrow, Elizabeth Lane were unfamiliar save for the last, which sent a jolt through her. Lane, Thomas's family, the list, she realized, must name Sir Henry's accomplices in hiding the treasure, or perhaps those who knew of it. Elizabeth Lane, perhaps an ancestor, tied Thomas to this secret in a way she had not expected. Miss Marple's mind raced as she tucked the brooch and list into her handbag. Thomas had found this box, she was certain, and its discovery had made him dangerous. The sapphire, likely worth a fortune, was motive enough for silence, and the list of names suggested a conspiracy that reached into the present. Clara Voss, as Sir Henry's descendant, would want to protect her family's claim to the brooch, and Dr. Haydock's involvement hinted at a shared stake. But why Elizabeth Lane? Was Thomas's family part of the original plot, or had he stumbled into it unaware? As she closed the panel and replaced the stone, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. She froze, her breath shallow, and turned slowly to see a figure at the top of the stairs. It was Peter Voss, his young face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he stammered, his voice breaking the belfry silence. "What are you doing up here?" She rose, her expression calm but her mind alert. "Just admiring the bells, Peter," she said, her tone light. "They're such a part of the village, aren't they? Thomas was fond of them, I hear. Did he ever tell you anything special about them?" Peter's hands fidgeted, and he glanced at the stairs as if considering flight. They were old, that they had stories. I thought he was joking. He was always talking about the past, about Sir Henry and the Vosses. Said there was something hidden, but I didn't believe him. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was steady. "And did he show you anything? Papers, perhaps, or something else?" Peter shook his head, too quickly. "No, nothing. I've got to go and Clara's waiting." He turned and hurried down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the tower. Miss Marple watched him go, her lips pursed. Peter knew more than he admitted, she was certain, but pressing him now would yield little. She descended carefully, the weight of the brooch in her handbag, a tangible reminder of the stakes. The churchyard was empty as she left, but she felt eyes on her, a prickle of awareness that made her quicken her pace. Someone had sent Peter to the belfry, perhaps Clara or Dr. Haydock, and her presence there had not gone unnoticed. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple locked the door and drew the curtains, her movements deliberate. She spread the contents of the box on her table, the sapphire brooch, its facets glinting, and the list of names. Elizabeth Lane's inclusion suggested a family secret, one Thomas had uncovered and perhaps shared with the wrong person. Clara's nervousness, Dr. Haydock's urgency, and now Peter's unease, pointed to a conspiracy to keep the brooch hidden or to claim it for themselves. Reverend Clement's hesitation, she suspected, stemmed from partial knowledge, a fear of what the chest and belfry might reveal. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple resolved to confront Dr. Haydock. His involvement was undeniable, and his nervous demeanor suggested he was less guarded than Clara. She would visit his surgery tomorrow, under the pretext of a minor ailment, and probe gently for answers. The belfry had revealed its secret, but Thomas's fate remained a shadow. Over St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to bring it to light. Chapter 9. The Doctor's Confession. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with a deceptive calm. The village bathed in a soft light that belied the undercurrent of unease rippling through its quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her small writing desk, sipped her tea with a steady hand, though her mind was far from tranquil. The sapphire brooch and the list of names from the belfry's hidden box lay locked in her desk drawer, their presence a constant reminder of the secret Thomas Lane had uncovered, a secret tied to Sir Henry Voss's legacy and, she suspected, to his disappearance. The encounter with Peter Voss in the belfry, his nervous denial of knowledge, had sharpened her focus on the web of connections linking Clara Voss, Dr. Haydock, and the silent bells of St. Mary's. Today, she resolved to confront the doctor, whose urgent words in the church and nervous demeanour at Mrs. Price's cottage suggested a man caught in a secret he could not fully conceal. Miss Marple dressed with her usual care, choosing a plain grey dress and a hat that lent her an air of unassuming respectability. Her handbag, containing the note, the brass button, and now a mental catalogue of the belfry's revelations, was a quiet companion as she stepped into the village. The air was fresh, scented with dew and the faint smoke of early fires, and the streets were beginning to stir. She passed the Blue Boar, where Mrs. Bantry was arranging flowers in a window box. Her cheerful wave, a contrast to the gravity of Miss Marple's mission. Peter Voss was nowhere to be seen, but Clara's silhouette was visible in the post office, her movements brisk but her face drawn, as if sleep had eluded her. Dr. Haydock's surgery was a tidy building near the village green, its brass plaque gleaming in the morning sun. Miss Marple entered under the pretext of a nagging cough, her expression one of mild concern. The waiting room was empty, save for a stack of outdated magazines, and the nurse, a brisk young woman named Mary, ushered her in with a smile. The doctor's just finishing some paperwork. Miss Marple won't be a moment. Dr. Haydock looked up from his desk as she entered, his face betraying a flicker of unease before he masked it with a professional smile. Miss Marple, what a surprise. A cough, is it? Let's have a look. His hands, usually steady, fumbled slightly with his stethoscope, and Miss Marple noted the strain in his eyes, the slight tremor in his fingers. She sat, her posture relaxed, but her gaze sharp. It's nothing serious, doctor, just a tickle. But while I'm here, I wanted to ask about poor Thomas Lane. His absence is so troubling, don't you think? You saw him often, didn't you? The doctor's hands stilled, and he leaned back, his smile fading. Thomas, yes, a good man. It's odd, his disappearing like that. I've checked his cottage, but there's no sign of him. His voice was careful, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw. Mrs. Price mentioned he was worried about the bells, she said, her tone conversational. Said they held secrets, and I couldn't help but overhear something in the churchyard the other night about something hidden in the bells. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Dr. Haydock's face paled, and for a moment his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. He set down the stethoscope, his hands clasping together on the desk. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, you're too observant for your own good. I don't know what you heard, but you're meddling in things best left alone. Miss Marple's eyes met his, gentle but unyielding. I'm only trying to understand what happened to Thomas, doctor. He found something in the belfry, didn't he? Something valuable, perhaps, tied to the Voss family. And you and Clara were discussing it, weren't you? The doctor's shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his greying hair, his composure crumbling under her steady gaze. You don't miss much, do you? He said, almost to himself. All right, I'll tell you what I know, but you must keep it to yourself. Thomas came to me a week ago, frantic. He'd found a box in the belfry papers and a brooch, a sapphire. He thought it was Sir Henry Voss's, hidden before the bells were stolen in 1890. He wanted to turn it over to the authorities, to clear his family's name. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. His family's name? Dr. Haydock nodded, his voice heavy. There was a list in the box, names of people who helped Sir Henry hide the brooch. One was Elizabeth Lane, Thomas's great-grandmother. He thought it proved his family wasn't involved in the theft, that they were protecting the Vosses' secret. But Clara, he hesitated, his eyes flickering with guilt. Go on, Miss Marple said softly, her tone encouraging but firm. Clara was terrified, he admitted. The Voss family's reputation is all she has left. If the brooch came to light, with those papers, it would drag up the old scandal, Sir Henry's theft, the cover-up. She begged me to help her hide it again, to keep Thomas quiet. I didn't want to, but she was desperate. She said she'd spoken to Thomas, tried to convince him to stay silent, but he wouldn't listen. Miss Marple's mind raced, fitting the doctor's words into the puzzle. And where is Thomas now, doctor? Did Clara do something to him? Dr. Haydock's face crumpled, and he shook his head. I don't know, I swear. I told her to leave. It alone, that Thomas would come around. But she was so afraid. I haven't seen him since Saturday, and Clara's been like a ghost herself. I'm worried, Miss Marple. If something's happened to him, I'll never forgive myself. Miss Marple leaned back, her expression one of quiet sympathy, but her thoughts were sharp. Dr. Haydock's confession confirmed the brooch's significance and Clara's motive, but his claim of ignorance about Thomas's fate rang true. He was too shaken to lie convincingly. Clara, however, was another matter. Her fear of scandal, her presence in the churchyard, and the button from her coat all pointed to a deeper involvement. Thank you, doctor, she said, rising. You've been very candid. I'll keep this between us, but you must tell the police if you hear anything about Thomas. It's the right thing to do. He nodded, his face etched with worry. I will. Be careful, Miss Marple. Clara's not herself, and this business, it's dangerous. As she left the surgery, the village seemed to close in around her, its familiar facades hiding currents of fear and secrecy. Clara's desperation, Dr. Haydock's guilt, and the sapphire brooch pointed to a truth buried in the belfry. But Thomas's fate remained a shadow. Miss Marple resolved to confront Clara next, to press her gently and see what her sharp eyes might reveal. The bells of St. Mary's, Silence and Sunday, were at the heart of this mystery, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was drawing closer to their secret. Chapter 10. Clara's motive. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the cobblestones and softening the edges of the village's quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her handbag heavy with the weight of the sapphire brooch, the list of names, the cryptic note, and the brass button, walked with her usual unhurried gait toward the post office. Dr. Haydock's confession had illuminated the stakes. A valuable brooch hidden by Sir Henry Voss, a scandal tied to his family, and Thomas Lane's determination to reveal it, thwarted by Clara Voss's fear of disgrace. The doctor's guilt and uncertainty about Thomas's fate pointed to Clara as the key to the mystery's heart. Miss Marple's sharp mind, honed by years of observing human nature, sensed that Clara's guarded demeanor hid more than fear. She was protecting something, or someone, and the truth lay in her silences. The post office was quiet, it's small, window displaying a neat row of stamps and notices. Inside, Clara Voss stood behind the counter, sorting letters with a mechanical precision that belied the tension in her posture. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back, and her face, usually sharp with efficiency, was pale, her eyes shadowed. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her expression flickering with a mix of wariness and resignation. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped. "Twice in 1 week. To what do I owe this visit?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but unyielding behind her spectacles. "Just a small matter, Miss Voss. I've been so worried about Thomas Lane. His absence is felt, isn't it? I thought you might have heard something, being so central to the village." Clara's hands paused, a letter hovering over the sorting tray. "I've heard nothing," she said, her tone flat. "Thomas kept to himself. If he's gone off, it's his own business." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as... She set her handbag on the counter, its contents a silent accusation. "But he was troubled, wasn't he? Mrs. Price said he spoke of secrets in the bells, something he found in the belfry. And you were close to him, weren't you? He trusted you." Clara's lips tightened, and her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. "Trusted me. He talked nonsense, that's all. Bells don't hold secrets, Miss Marple. You, of all people, should know better than to listen to gossip." Miss Marple's smile remained, but her gaze sharpened. "Oh, I don't rely on gossip, my dear, but I did find something curious in the belfry, a button from a coat much like yours, and I couldn't help overhearing you in the churchyard speaking with Dr. Haydock about something hidden in the bells. Thomas found it, didn't he? A brooch, perhaps, tied to your family's past." Clara's face drained of color, and her hands gripped the counter, the letter crumpling in her fingers. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of denial, but Miss Marple's steady gaze held her, and her shoulders slumped. "You're too clever, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Thomas found the brooch. He came to me, said it was Sir Henry's, hidden in the bells before they were stolen. He wanted to give it to the authorities, to clear his family's name, some nonsense about his great-grandmother being involved. I couldn't let him." Miss Marple's heart sank, but her expression remained calm. "Couldn't let him, Clara? What did you do?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes, and she sank onto a stool behind the counter, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice muffled. "I met him in the belfry that night, Saturday. I begged him to keep quiet, to think of my family, my name. The Vosses have nothing but our reputation, and that brooch it would drag up everything, the theft, the lies. He wouldn't listen. He said the truth had to come out. We argued, and I pushed him just to make him stop. He fell, hit his head on the bell frame. He wasn't moving." Miss Marple's breath caught, but she kept her voice steady. "And then, Clara, what did you do?" Clara's hands dropped, her face etched with anguish. "I panicked. I couldn't leave him there. I dragged him to the crypt, hid him behind the old tombs. I thought I could figure it out, make it look like he'd left the village. But Dr. Haydock saw me coming out of the church. He guessed something was wrong, and I told him everything. He promised to help, to keep it quiet, but he's been a wreck since." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. The button from Clara's coat, left in the belfry during her struggle with Thomas. Dr. Haydock's nervous alliance, born of loyalty or fear, and the brooch, a glittering motive for silence. "You must tell the police, Clara," she said gently. "It was an accident, but hiding it only makes it worse. Thomas deserves the truth, and so does his sister." Clara's tears fell freely now, and she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I know, I've been so afraid, Miss Marple. I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted to protect my family." Miss Marple reached out, her hand resting lightly on Clara's. "I understand, my dear, but the truth has a way of coming out, and it's better you tell it yourself. I'll go with you, if you like." Clara nodded again, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple rose, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. The mystery of the bells was unraveling, but the cost was a tragedy she had hoped to avoid. As she left the post office, the village seemed quieter, its calm facade shattered by the truth hidden in its heart. She would accompany Clara to the police, ensuring Thomas's fate was known, and the sapphire brooch would find its rightful place no longer. A secret buried in the bells. Chapter 11. The bells ring again. The evening light draped St. Mary Mead in a golden hush, the village settling into the familiar rhythm of dusk as the church tower of St. Mary's cast its long shadow across the green. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, her handbag lighter now that the sapphire brooch and the list of names had been handed to the police, along with Clara Voss's tearful confession. The weight of the truth, however, pressed heavily upon her. Clara's account of the fateful night in the belfry, her desperate push, Thomas Lane's fall, and the frantic concealment in the crypt had unraveled the mystery, but it left a somber mark on the village's quiet heart. Miss Marple's sharp mind, though satisfied with the resolution, felt the ache of a tragedy that might have been avoided. The police had arrived promptly after Clara's confession, led by Inspector Craddock, a young man with a keen eye and a respect for Miss Marple's insight. They had found Thomas Lane's body in the crypt, hidden behind a crumbling tomb, his head bearing the mark of a fatal blow from the bell frame. Clara, pale and trembling, had been taken into custody, her sobs echoing through the churchyard as the villagers gathered, their whispers a mix of shock and sorrow. Dr. Haydock, summoned to confirm the cause of death, had stood silently, his face etched with guilt for his part in keeping Clara's secret. Miss Marple had watched it all from the edge of the crowd, her expression calm but her heart heavy now, as she reached her garden gate. The first clear notes of the church bells rang out their cadence, steady and true for the first time since that discordant Sunday. Reverend Clement had found a new bell ringer, young Peter Voss, who had taken up the ropes with a solemn determination, perhaps to atone for his aunt's actions. The sound drifted over the village, a reminder of order restored, but to Miss Marple it carried a note of mourning for Thomas Lane, whose curiosity had led to his end. She entered her cottage, setting her handbag on the table and lighting the lamp. The fire crackled softly, and she sat, her knitting untouched, her thoughts turning over the events of the day. Clara's motive, protecting her family's name from the scandal of Sir Henry Voss's theft, had driven her to a desperate act, one she now regretted with every fibre of her being. Dr. Haydock's complicity, born of misguided loyalty, had kept the truth hidden, but his confession to Miss Marple had set the wheels of justice in motion. The sapphire brooch, now in the hands of the police, would be returned to the Voss family's distant heirs, its glittering beauty no longer a secret to be guarded at such a cost. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Reverend Clement stood on the threshold, his spectacles slightly askew, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I wanted to thank you. The police told me how you pieced it all together, the brooch, the papers, Clara's confession. I don't know how you do it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, gesturing for him to sit. "It's only a matter of watching, Reverend, and listening. People are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or anywhere else. They hide their fears, their guilt, but the truth always shows itself in a look, a word, a hesitation." The vicar nodded, his hands clasped tightly. "I should have spoken sooner. I knew Thomas was troubled, poking about in the vestry records, asking about Sir Henry Voss. I thought it was harmless curiosity, but when he vanished, I feared something terrible had happened. I should have trusted you. You did your best." Miss Marple said gently, "Fear can make us all hesitate. But the bells are ringing again, and that's a start." Reverend Clement managed a small smile. "Yes, Peter's doing well. He's a good lad, despite everything. I hope this doesn't break him." "It won't," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "Young people are resilient, and Peter has a good heart. He'll carry on, and so will the village." The vicar rose, thanking her again before leaving. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the bell's steady toll filling the silence. The list of names, William Carver, John Harrow, Elizabeth Lane, had been handed to the police, who were tracing the Voss family's heirs to settle the matter of the brooch. Elizabeth Lane, Thomas's great-grandmother, had been an accomplice in Sir Henry's scheme, a fact that had driven Thomas to clear his family's name. His death was a tragedy, but his intent had been honourable, and Miss Marple took quiet comfort in that. As the bells fell silent, the village seemed to breathe again, its rhythm restored. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts. The mystery of the bells had been solved, but St. Mary Mead, like all small places, would always hold its secret small jealousies, hidden fears, moments of weakness. She would watch, as she always did, her sharp eyes missing nothing, ready for the next ripple in the village's calm waters. Muj High is Pori story, car better. Hook, first 30 seconds, people attention, K Leah Lickdane. Yesma, Pori story, explain ho, riho, in English. Chapter 12. A quiet resolution autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and russet, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. The church bells of St. Mary's rang out with their familiar cadence, their clear notes drifting over the cobblestone lanes and thatched cottages, a sound that had once faltered, but now sang true. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the village settle into its evening rhythm. The mystery of Thomas Lane's disappearance had been laid to rest, but its echoes lingered, a reminder of the fragility beneath the village's calm surface. The sapphire brooch, that glittering relic of Sir Henry Voss's scandal, had been returned to the Voss family's distant heirs, a quiet transaction overseen by Inspector Craddock and Mr. Petherick, the solicitor. The list of names, William Carver, John Harrow, Elizabeth Lane, had been archived in the parish records, closing a chapter of history that had cost Thomas his life. Clara Voss, her confession made in the post office under Miss Marple's gentle but unrelenting gaze, awaited trial, her fate tempered by the acknowledgement that her act was born of panic rather than malice. Dr. Haydock, shaken by his complicity, had offered a full statement to the police, his reputation bruised but his conscience eased by the truth. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Ellen Price, Thomas's sister, who carried a small basket of apples from her garden. Her face, once etched with worry, bore a quiet sorrow now, softened by the villagers' support. "Miss Marple," she said, setting the basket on the garden table, "I can't thank you enough. You found the truth about Thomas, gave him justice. I only wish he hadn't gone looking for those secrets." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes kind but steady. "He was a good man, Mrs. Price, wanting to clear your family's name. Elizabeth Lane's part in Sir Henry's scheme weighed on him, but he meant well. The bells sound peaceful now, don't they?" Mrs. Price nodded, her gaze drifting to the church tower. "They do. Peter's doing a fine job ringing them. He's been so kind, despite everything with Clara. The village feels right again." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the wool in her lap. "It does, indeed. St. Mary Mead has a way of healing itself, but it needs a nudge sometimes to bring things into the open." Mrs. Price lingered a moment, then took her leave, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Miss Marple watched her go, her thoughts turning to the village's quiet resilience. The church records had been updated. The scandal of 1890 laid bare for those who cared to read it, and the bells, free of their secret, rang with a clarity that seemed to cleanse the air. Peter Voss, young and earnest, had taken up the bell-ringer's role, his quick hands learning the ropes under Reverend Clement's guidance. The vicar, too, had found his footing, his nervous hesitations replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the garden, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the village green. A few children played near the pump, their laughter a soft counterpoint to the bell's final notes. Mrs. Weatherby swept her doorstep, her gossip now tempered by the weight of recent events. Dr. Haydock, passing by on his rounds, tipped his hat, his face less haunted than it had been. Even Clara's absence, though felt, was softened by the village's ability to move forward, to weave the tragedy into its fabric without breaking dot. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. The mystery of the bells had been solved, not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence she brought to all such matters. St. Mary Mead, with its orderly lanes and hidden currents, was much like her garden, peaceful on the surface, but always in need of tending. She would watch, as she always did, her sharp eyes catching the smallest ripples, ready for the next secret to surface in the village's calm waters. The end.